It was to Merrington's credit as an official that he suppressed his feelings as a man on hearing Caldu's story, and did everything possible to retrieve the situation once he was convinced that Nepcote had fled. Any lingering doubts he may have had were scattered on learning, after confidential inquiry at Whitehall, that Captain Nepcote had not put in an appearance at the War Office that day, and had neither requested nor been granted leave of absence from his duties. On receipt of this information, Merrington turned to his office telephone, and, receiver in hand, bellowed forth peremptory instructions which set in motion the far-reaching organization of Scotland Yard for the capture of a fugitive from justice. Nepcote's description was circulated to police stations, detectives were told off to keep an eye on outgoing trains and the docks, and the entrances to the tubes and underground railways were watched. After enclosing London, Merrington made a wider cast, and long before nightfall he had flung around England a net of fine meshes through which no man could wriggle. But it is difficult even for Scotland Yard to lay quick hands on a fugitive in the vast city of London, as Merrington well knew. While waiting for the net to close over his destined captive, he decided in the new strange turn of the case to investigate the whole of the circumstances afresh. Inquiries set afoot in London, with the object of discovering all that could be learnt of Nepcote's career and Violet Herodotus' single life, occupied an important share in Scotland Yard's renewed investigations into the Herodotus murder. Caldu was sent to Herodotus to look for new facts. He returned after a day's absence with information which might have been obtained before if chance had not directed suspicion to Hazel Rath, with the story of an unknown young man who had left the London train to Herodotus at Weydene Junction on the night of the murder. The story, as extracted from an unintelligent ticket collector, threw no light on the identity of the stranger beyond a statement that he had worn a long light trench coat, beneath which the collector had caught a glimpse of khaki uniform as the gentleman felt for his ticket at the barrier. On that slight information, Caldu had pursued inquiries across a long 2 miles of country between Weydene and the Moathouse, and had deemed himself fortunate in finding a farm labourer who, on his homeward walk that night, had been passed by a young man in a long coat making rapidly across the fields in the direction of Herodotus. The labourer had stared after the retreating figure until it disappeared in the darkness, and had then gone home without thinking any more of the incident. Caldu was so impressed by the significance of the second appearance of the man in the trenchcoat that he had timed himself in a fast walk over the same ground from Weydene to the Moathouse, and was able to cover the distance in half an hour. On the basis of these facts, he pointed out to Merrington that, if Nepcote was the man who left the train at Weydene at 7 o'clock, he had time to walk across the fields and reach the Moathouse by 7:30, which was 10 minutes before the murder was committed. Merrington admitted the possibility, but refused to accept the inference. He was forced by recent events to accept the theory of Nepcote's implication in the mystery, but he was not prepared to believe without much more definite proof that he was the murderer. He was still strong in his belief that Hazel Rath was the person who had killed Mrs. Herodotus, whatever the young man's share in the crime might be. The discovery about the man in the trench coat was all very well as far as it went, and perhaps formed another clue in the puzzling set of circumstances of the case, but it did not carry them very far, and certainly did nothing to lessen the weight of evidence against the girl who was charged with the murder. Merrington was forced back on the conclusion that the most important step towards the solution of the mystery was to lay hold of Nepcote, and to that end he directed his own efforts and that of the service of the great organization at his command. As the days went on, he supplemented his original arrangements for Nepcote's arrest with guileful traps. The female dragon who guarded masculine reputations at 10 Sherryman Street was badgered into cold anger by pretty girls, who sought with tips and blandishments to glean scraps of information about the missing tenant. Scented letters in female handwriting, marked important, appeared in the letter racks of Nepcote's West End clubs. Merrington even inserted an advertisement in the personal column of the Times, setting forth a touching female appeal to Nepcote for a meeting in his sequestered spot. At the end of 3 days, with no sign of Nepcote in that period, Merrington was compelled to make application to the Sussex magistrates for another adjournment of the police court proceedings, on the ground that fresh information needed investigation before Scotland Yard could proceed with the charge against Hazel Rath. An additional week was granted with reluctance by the chairman of the bench, a nonconformist draper with political ambitions, who seized the opportunity to impress the electors of a constituency he was nursing for the next general election by making some spirited remarks on the sanctity of British liberty, which he coupled with a scathing reference to the dilatory methods of Scotland Yard. He let it be understood that the police must be prepared at the next hearing to go on with the charge against the prisoner or withdraw it altogether. In the face of these awkward alternatives, Merrington pursued the quest for Nepcote with vigor. The men working immediately under his instructions were spurred into an excess of energy which brought about the detention of several young men who could not adequately explain themselves or their right to liberty in the great city of London. But none of these captures turned out to be Nepcote. Merrington believed he was hiding in London, but at the end of 5 days he still remained mysteriously at liberty in spite of the constant search for him. He seemed to have disappeared as completely as though he had passed out of the world and merged his identity into a chiseled name and a banal aspiration on a tombstone. In the angry consciousness of failure, Merrington was not blind to the fact that he had only his own impetuosity to blame for allowing Nepcote to slip through his fingers. His mistake was due to his dislike of private detectives and his unbelief in modern deductive methods of crime solution. His own system, which is the system of Scotland Yard, was based on motive and knowledge. If he found a strong motive for a crime, he searched for the person to whom it pointed. If there was no apparent motive, he fell back on his great knowledge of the underworld and its denizens to fit a criminal to the crime. The system has its measure of success, as the records of Scotland Yard attest. Merrington had brought both methods to bear in his handling of the Herodotus case. When his original investigations failed to reveal a motive for the murder, he determined to return to London to ascertain what dangerous criminals were at liberty who might have committed the murder. His own view then was that the murder was the work of an old hand who had entered the moat house to commit burglary, and had murdered Mrs. Herodotus to escape identification. The isolation of the moat house, the presence of guests with valuable jewels, the time chosen for the crime, and the scream of the victim, tended to confirm him in this belief. Caldu's chance discovery about Hazel Rath, and the subsequent events which arrayed such strong circumstantial evidence against her, brought the other side of the system uppermost and set Merrington seeking for a motive which would accord with the presumption of the girl's guilt. Having found that motive, he was satisfied that he had done his duty, and he thought very little more about the case. It was his tenacious adhesion to conservative methods which caused him to blunder in his treatment of Colwyn's information about the missing necklace. He rarely acted on impulse. His habitual distrust of humanity was deep, and to it was wedded a wariness which was the heritage of long experience. But his obstinate conviction of Hazel Rath's guilt led him to make a false move in his effort to square the loss of the necklace with the evidence against the girl. His own poor opinion of human nature hindered him from seeing, as Colwyn had seen, any inconsequence between such widely different motives as madden love and theft. That was one of those subtle differentiations of human psychology in which his coarse-grained temperament was at fault. It is probable that Merrington's dislike of private detectives contributed to obscure his judgment at a critical moment. He was unable to see that Colwyn, by reason of his intellect and practical capacity, stood in a class apart and alone. In his contemplation of the case, Merrington's thoughts turned to Colwyn, and he wondered in what direction the private detective's investigations into the case had progressed, if they had progressed at all, since he had seen him last. In a chastened mood, he reflected that Colwyn had not only given him a warning which was annoyingly different from other advice in being well worth following, but had acted generously in informing him of the missing necklace when he might have kept the discovery to himself, in order to score a point over Scotland Yard and place one of the Yard's most distinguished officials in an awkward position. With a belated but unconscious recognition of an intelligence which far surpassed his own, Merrington felt that it would be worthwhile to have another talk with Colwyn, in the hope of finding some way out of the perplexities in which he had plunged himself by permitting Nepcote to escape. The next interview, which was of his seeking, took place at Colwyn's rooms in the evening, after Merrington had previously arranged for it by telephone. The face of the private detective revealed neither surprise nor resentment at the sight of Merrington. He invited his guest to sit down, and then seated himself a little distance from the table, on which whiskey and cigars were set out. "Well, Mr. Colwyn, you were right and I was wrong about that fellow Nepcote," Merrington commenced, realizing that it was best to come to the point at once. "I wish now that I had followed your advice. If you hadn't gone to see him, perhaps you wouldn't know as much as you know now," said Colwyn drily. "That's one way of looking at it," responded Merrington with his great laugh. "Unfortunately, that interview caused Nepcote to bolt, and so far he has shown us a clean pair of heels." "You've had no news of him?" "Only a lot of false reports. I am convinced that he is still hiding in London, but the trouble is to get hold of him. These infernal darkened streets make it more difficult. A wanted man can walk along them at night right under the nose of the police without fear of being seen." "Have you made any fresh discoveries about the case?" "We have ascertained that a man who may have been Nepcote was seen near the moat house on the night of the murder." Colwyn nodded indifferently. The tracing of Nepcote's movements on the night of the murder was to him one of the minor points of the problem, like the first pawn move in chess, essential, but without real significance, in view of the inevitable inference of the flight. "I have been working on the case from this end," he said. "In what direction?" "Trying to arrive at the beginning of the mystery. I have been endeavoring to find out something about Mrs. Herodotus' earlier life. It struck me that it might throw some light on the subsequent events. I have been investigating along similar lines. Shall we compare notes?" "With pleasure, but I should think that you have been able to find out more than I have been able to discover single-handed. For one thing, I have seen Lady Vaughan, the wife of Sir William Vaughan, of the War Office. She is a kind and gracious woman, taking a great interest in the hundreds of girl clerks employed at her husband's department in Whitehall. Last winter she gave a series of dances at her house in Knightsbridge, and the girls were invited in turns. Mr. Herodotus was present at one of these functions." "So much I know," said Merrington. "Then you are probably aware that Captain Nepcote was also present that evening, and brought several other young officers with him. It was he who introduced Philip Herodotus to the girl whom he afterwards married." "I knew Nepcote was a guest at one of the dances, but it is news to me that he introduced the girl to young Herodotus. Lady Vaughan did not tell us this." "Lady Vaughan did not know. I ascertained the fact later from one of the guests who witnessed the introduction. I attach some importance to the point. Last winter Philip Herodotus and Nepcote were on fairly intimate terms, working together in the same room at the War Office, and sometimes going together to the houses of mutual friends. It was evidently a case of the attraction of opposites." "It must have been," replied Merrington emphatically. "I have had inquiries made about Nepcote, and I should not have thought he would have appealed to Mr. Herodotus. There is nothing actually wrong so far as we can learn, but he had the reputation, before the war, of a fast and idle young man about town, with a weakness for women and gambling. He came into a few thousands some years ago, but soon spent it. I imagine that he has subsisted principally on credit and gambling since he squandered his money, for he is certainly not the type of man to live on his pay as an officer. As a matter of fact, he was in serious trouble with the army authorities recently for not paying his mess bills in France. He was not brought up to the army, and he has seen very little active service. He got his captain's commission about 12 months after the war commenced, when the War Office was handing out commissions like boxes of matches, but he managed to keep under the Whitehall umbrella until quite recently. He seems to have a bit of a pull somewhere, though I cannot find out where. Perhaps it is his charm of manner. Everybody who knows him says he has a charming manner, though it wasn't apparent to me that night I interviewed him at his flat." Perhaps he was too afraid to exercise it on that occasion, suggested Colwyn, with a smile. He must have thought that it was all up with him. Have you discovered anything about Mrs. Herodotus' antecedents? Asked Merrington with an abruptness which suggested that he had little relish for the last remark. Very little, apart from the fact that she lived in rooms, and had no real girlfriends, so far as I can ascertain. Apparently she was a girl who played a lone hand, as they say in America. The type is not uncommon in large cities. My information, such as it is not of the least importance one way or the other. I have learned very little more than you, except that she changed her rooms pretty frequently, but always kept within an easy radius of the West End, living in dull but respectable neighborhoods like Russell Square and Woburn Place. It was precious little time she spent there, though. The people of these places know nothing about her except that she used to go out in the morning and did not return till late at night, generally in a taxi, and alone, so far as is known. She was, apparently, one of those bachelor girls who have sprung into existence in thousands during the war, one of that distinct species who trade on their good looks and are out for a good time, but keep sufficiently on the safe side of the fence to be careful of their reputations. It's part of their stock in trade. Such girls contrive to go everywhere and see everything at the expense of young men with more money than brains, who have been caught by their looks. It's the Savoy for lunch, a West End restaurant for dinner, review, late supper, and home in a taxi, with perhaps a kiss for the lot by way of payment. The War Office was a godsend to this type of girl. It gives them jobs with nothing to do, with a kind of official standing thrown in, and the chance of meeting plenty of young officers over on leave from the front, with money to burn and hungry for pretty English faces. It is difficult to find out anything about these bachelor girls. They have no homes, only a place to sleep in, they confide in nobody, and their men friends will never give them away. Almost any woman will give away a man, but I have never yet known a man give away a woman. If Mrs. Herodotus was that type of girl, it is possible that some early episode or forgotten flirtation in her past life is mixed up with the mystery of her death. You think that, do you? Asked Merrington, regarding his companion attentively. How else can we explain Nepcote's appearance in the mystery, except on the ground that he may have murdered her for the necklace? It is important to bear in mind that Nepcote knew her in her single days. If she had a secret, she has taken it to the grave with her. There remains Nepcote, who is deeply implicated in the case in some way. You may learn something from him if you can catch him and induce him to speak, though I must confess I find it difficult to reconcile the supposition that he committed the murder with the known circumstances of the case. There I agree with you, exclaimed Merrington. What is Hazel Rath's position if we admit any such supposition? Nothing has yet come to light to shake the evidence which points to her as the person who murdered Mrs. Herodotus. Does she still refuse to speak? Yes. She is as obstinate as a mule and as mute as a fish. I sent a very clever woman detective down to the jail at Lewes to try and coax her to say something, but she could get nothing out of her. She said she had no statement to make, and nothing whatever to say. She refused to go beyond that. She may have some strong reason for keeping silence, remarked Colwyn thoughtfully. Arrested persons sometimes remain silent under a grave charge because they are anxious to keep certain knowledge in their possession from the police. Nepcote's implication in the case lends color to the theory that Hazel Rath may be keeping silent for some such purpose. In order to shield Nepcote? It is possible, though I do not think we are in a position to infer that much without further knowledge. But now that we know that Nepcote is connected with the case, I certainly think that a strong effort should be made to induce Hazel Rath to speak. It is not to be done, replied Merrington, with an emphatic shake of the head. The girl is not to be drawn. Have you told her about the recent developments of the case? About Nepcote, do you mean? Yes.
"Certainly not," replied Merrington, in a tone of outraged officialism.
To give the girl that piece of information before I know what it means would place such a powerful weapon in the hands of the lawyer for the defense that I should have to withdraw the charge against Hazel Rath at the next police court proceedings if I did not arrest Nepcote in the meantime. I do not want any dramatic developments, as the idiotic newspapers call it, in my cases.
There is a certain amount of public sympathy with this girl already.
I think you stand to gain more than you lose by telling her that Nepcote is suspected.
I prefer to arrest Nepcote first.
We may get him at any moment, and then, I hope, we shall find out where we stand in this case.
But what do you mean by saying that I have more to gain than lose by telling the girl about him?
If she is keeping silent to shield Nepcote, she is likely to reveal the truth when she knows that there is nothing more to be gained by silence. She will then begin to think of herself.
In my opinion, you have now an excellent weapon in your hand to force her to speak. Can we go so far as to assume that she is keeping silence to shield him?
Let us assume that they went to Mrs. Herodotus' room together for the purpose of murder and robbery.
The girl, we will suppose, fired the shot and Nepcote escaped from the window with the necklace. Is Hazel Rath likely to reveal such a story when she knows it will not save herself? Your assumptions carry you too far, returned Colwyn.
Our presumptive knowledge does not take us that distance.
Till Nepcote's share in the case is explained, it is useless indulging in speculations outside our premises. Let us defer inferences until we have marshaled more facts.
We do not know whether more than one pair of eyes witnessed the murder of Mrs. Herodotus. The theory that Hazel Rath fired the shot is merely a presumption of fact, and not an actual certainty.
Much is still hidden in this case, and the question is, can Hazel Rath enlighten us?
As she and Nepcote are now both implicated, it seems to me that the best inducement to get her to speak is by letting her know that you have arrested Nepcote.
In my opinion, the experiment is well worth trying.
Merrington rose to his feet and paced across the room, pondering over the proposal.
I am inclined to believe you are right, he said. At any rate, I shall go down to Lewes tomorrow and put it to the test. I would ask you to accompany me, but it would be a little irregular.
I shall be content to learn the result, Colwyn answered.